Chapter 20 of The Late Tenant by Gordon Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. David has one visitor and expects others. David had risen pretty early to admit his charwoman. Behind her, in the outer lobby, he saw the scared face of the hall porter, who remembered that a certain loud knocking and difficulty of gaining access to that flat on one other occasion had been the prelude to a tragic discovery, though he, not being in the building at that time, had heard of the affair only from his mates. David smiled reassurance at him and went back to his bedroom to dress. He placed the portrait and the letter in an inner pocket of his waistcoat provided for paper money, and, the hour being in advance of breakfast time, went out for a stroll. Regent's Park was delightful that morning. Not spring, but summer was in the air. Nature, to compel man to admire her dainty contrivances, was shutting in the vistas. Already trees and hedgerows flung their leafy screens across the landscape. So David wandered on, promising himself many such mornings with Violet. For it passed his wit to see how Van Hupfeldt could wriggle out of the testimony of his own picture and his own handwriting. Hence, instead of being earlier, he was somewhat later than usual in sitting down to breakfast, and he was a surprised young man when, his charwoman having gone to answer a ring at the door, the announcement came of "A lady to see you, sir." "A lady?" he gasped. "Who is she?" And he hoped wildly that it might be Violet. "You know her well enough, old boy," came the high-pitched voice of Miss Ermine Lestrange, who now appeared in the dining-room, a pink-faced vision in a flower garden hat and muslins. "Poof!" she cried. "I have not been out for many a day before the streets were aired. Say, young party, that bacon and egg has a more gratifying scent than violets. I have come all the way from Chelsea on one cup of tea." The charwoman, eyeing the visitor askance, admitted that more supplies could be arranged. "Hurry up, then, Fairy," said Miss Lestrange. "And don't look so shocked. Your master here is the very goodest young man in London." David said that even the just man fell 7 times a day, but anyhow he was delighted to see her. "You look it," was the dry response. "I never knew anybody who threw their heart into their eyes as you do. You will never get on in London if you don't learn to lie better. When you say that sort of thing, you should gush a little and leer, at any rate when you're talking to a woman." "But I mean it," he vowed. "You can't tell how nice it is to have some frills on the other side of the table. That hat, now, is a picture." "The hat is a bad colour to suit, you know." "Ah, no. It has the gold of the sun in it. Perhaps I may be phrasing the words awkwardly, but you look 10 years younger this morning, Miss Lestrange." She turned her eyes to the ceiling. "Ye gods!" she cried. "If only I had those 10 back again!" Then she gave David a coy glance. "I don't mind betting you half a quid," she said, "that you are only pleased to see me here because I bring to your mind the possibility of another girl being your vis-à-vis at breakfast." "Now you would make me dumb when I am most anxious to talk." "Oh, you candid wretch! Why did I come here? Don't you believe that there are 20 men in London who would give quite a lot if I honoured them by this morning call?" "I do believe it," said David gravely. "And that is just why you are here, and not with one of the 20. You are a far more upright little lady than you profess to be, Miss Lestrange." She actually blushed, for, like most women who are compelled to make up professionally, never an atom of grease or rouge was on her face at other times. "David," she said, "you are a nice boy. I wish you were my brother." "You would be fine and dandy as a sister." "Well, let's be friends. And the first sign of friendship is a common alliance. I've taken your side against Strauss." "What of him?" demanded David warily, for Miss Ermyn was a slippery customer, he fancied. "Now, no fencing, or the alliance is off. You were down at Rigsworth yesterday, remember? And you came back in a mighty temper. Not even your pretty Violet was all perfection last evening, was she?" "Things did go wrong, I admit," said he, marvelling at this attack. "Well, I am not here to pump you, or else I would surprise you a bit more. No, David, I'm here just because I'm a woman, and as full of mischief as an egg is full of meat, so that I can't help interfering in a love affair, though it isn't my own. Did you know that Strauss brought Jenny to Rigsworth yesterday?" "Jenny? Why Jenny?" "That is what I wanted to know. And she wouldn't tell me, the cat, until I got my Irish up and offered to drag her over the furniture by the hair of her head. It was no use her lying to me either. Every time she tried to think of a plausible tale, I told her it would hurt to cross the chiffonnier head first. At last she owned up, and then I opened a small bottle. She wanted it, I assure you, and I got the whole story while we finished it." "But for goodness' sake—" "Whoa, boy! Don't rush your fences. I'll tell you everything, so keep calm. First, the night before last, Strauss comes to me—" "One moment," broke in David. "Is this Strauss?" And he handed her the portrait. She looked at it and laughed. "Why, of course it is," she said. "Fancy you keeping his picture over your heart. Now, if it had been Violet or me—" "Sorry to have interrupted you," he said. "Funny idea. Anyhow, Strauss turned up the night before last, and wanted to borrow Jenny for the whole of next day. It was beastly awkward, as she was helping me to rehem this dress and put new sleeves in the bodice, but he badgered me so that I could hardly refuse." And she thought for an instant of certain notes crumpled up in the gold purse which was slung from her neck. "So I packed Jenny off about 8 o'clock next morning, yesterday, that is. I was in a temper all day, and tore 2 flounces out of my frock, and scraped my shin on the step of a hansom. So when the minx came smirking home about midnight to find me making my own fire, I let her have it, I can tell you. But it fairly gave me the needle when she wouldn't say what Strauss wanted her for. Then the row sprang up. Guess you want a smoke, eh? I'd like a cigarette myself." David was most docile outwardly, when all of a boil within. He awaited her pleasure, saw her seated in a comfortable chair, joined in her own admiration of a pair of really pretty feet, and lit a pipe. Then she continued. "There was poisonous trouble for about 5 minutes. I might have let her off if she hadn't said things. Then I frightened her. I believe I did yank her hat off. At last she confessed that Strauss told her that his name now was Van Hupfeldt, and he wanted her to go down to Rigsworth to be introduced to 2 ladies as Sarah Gissing, Gwen Barnes's maid." "What?" yelled David, springing to his feet. "Oh, chuck it," said Miss L'Estrange, in a voice of deep disgust. "You nearly made me swallow my cigarette. But the man is a devil. Sit down, boy, sit down. You men are all 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, where a woman is concerned. Poor things! I wonder how any of us escape you at all. Still, Strauss is pretty artful, I admit. You see, Jenny, having been in service here, could lie so smoothly about Gwen Barnes that it would be hard to find her out." "Did she do this?" asked David in a fierce excitement. Miss L'Estrange laughed again as she selected a fresh cigarette to replace the spoiled one. "Did the cat steal the cream? Fancy Jenny being offered £20 for a day's prevarication and refusing it. Why, that girl lies for practice." "Oh, please, go on," he groaned. "Queer game, isn't it? I often think the halfpenny papers don't get hold of half the good things that are going. Well, Jenny, according to her own version, spoofed Mrs. Mordaunt and your Violet in great shape. What is more, Strauss and a lawyer man wheedled them into signing all sorts of papers, including a marriage settlement. Will you believe it? The Dutchman had the cheek to give your Violet the certificates, which Jenny sold to him." David said something under his breath. "Yes," said Miss L'Estrange, "he deserves it. I can't abide a man who goes in for deceiving a poor girl. So, at my own loss, mind you, I determined to come here this morning and give you a friendly tip." "Heaven knows I shall endeavour to repay you," sighed David, in a perfect heat now to be out and doing he knew not what. "Is she very beautiful, your Violet?" asked his visitor, turning on him with one of her bird-like movements of the head. "That is her sister," said David, flinging a hand toward the portrait. "Ah, I knew Gwen Barnes. Saw her in the theatre, you know. A nice girl, but nothing to rave about. Rather of the clinging sort. You men prefer that type, I do believe. And now that you have heard my yarn, you want me to go, eh?" "No, no. No hurry at all." "You dear David. Mouth all no, eyes all yes. That's it. Treat me like an old shoe. Bless you, we women worship that sort of thing, until, all at once, we blaze up. Well, you will give Strauss a drubbing one of these days, and I shan't be sorry. I hate pretty men. They are all affectation, and waxy like a barber's doll. Well, ta-ta. You are going to have a nice pleasant day, I can see. But fair play, mind. No telling tales about your little ermine. I have done more for you to-day than I would do for any other man in creation. And some day you must bring your Violet to tea. I promise to be good and talk nice. There now, ain't I a wonder?" And she was gone, in a whirl of flounces and high heels. The last he heard of her when she declined to let him come to the door, with that glare in his eye, being her friendly hail to the lift-man. "Hello, Jimmy! Like old times to see you again. How's the wife and the kiddies?" Left to his own devices, David was at his wits' end to know how to act for the best. At last he wrote a telegram to Violet. "The girl you met yesterday as Sarah Gissing was not your sister's maid, but another woman masquerading in her stead. I implore you and your mother to come to London and meet me in Mr. Dibbin's office. He knows the real Sarah Gissing, and will produce her." This was definite enough, and he thought the introduction of Dibbin's name would be helpful with Mrs. Mordaunt. Then he rushed off to see Dibbin himself, but learned from a clerk that the agent would not arrive from Scotland until 6:30 p.m. "Which is a pity," said the clerk ruefully, "because a first-rate commission has just come in for him by wire." "Some one in a hurry?" said Harcourt. speaking rather to cloak his own disappointment than out of any commiseration for Dibben's loss. "I should think so, indeed. 50 golden sovereigns sent by telegraph just to get him to Portsmouth quick." David heard and wondered. He made a chance shot. "I expect that's my friend Van Hupfeldt," he said. "The very man," gasped the clerk. "Oh, there's no harm done. Mr. Dibben comes to King's Cross, I suppose?" "Yes, I shall be there to meet him." Certainly things were lively at Rigsworth. David had a serious notion of going there by the next train. But he returned to Eddystone Mansions, in case there might be an answer from Violet. Sure enough, there he found the telegram sent in her name by Van Hupfeldt. The time showed that it was despatched about the same hour as his own. At first his heart danced with the joy of knowing that she still trusted him. And how truly wonderful that she mentioned Pangley, a town he had not named to her. There must indeed have been a tremendous eruption at Dale Manor. Yet it was too bad that he should be forced to leave London and go in chase of Mrs. Carter and the baby. Why, he would be utterly cut off from active communication with her for hours. And it was so vitally important that they should meet. Of course he would obey. But first he would await the chance of a reply to his message. So he telegraphed again. "Will go to Pangley. Tell me when I can see you." He was his own telegraph messenger. While he was out, another buff envelope found its way to his table. Here was the confusion of a fog, for this screed ran: "Miss Violet Mordaunt travelled to London this morning by the 9:11 train. This is right. Friend." There was no name, but the post office said the information came from Rigsworth. And the post office indulges in a cold official accuracy. Somehow this word from a friend did strike him as friendly. It made him read again and ponder weightily the longer statement signed Violet. He could not tell, oh sympathetic little sister of the Rigsworth postmistress, that you wheedled the grocer's assistant into writing that most important telegram. It was a piece of utmost daring on the part of a village maid, and perhaps it might be twisted into an infringement of the Official Secrets Act, or some such terrifying ordinance. But your tender little heart had gone out to the young man who got no answer from the lady of the manor, and you knew quite well that Violet had never sent him to Pangley to hunt for a missing baby. Anyhow, David was glowering at both flimsy strips of paper when a letter reached him. It was marked Express Delivery, and had been handed in at Euston Station soon after 12 o'clock. This time there could be no doubt whatever that Violet was the writer. Here was the identical handwriting of the first genuine note he had received from her, and there was Violet herself in the phrasing of it, though she was brief and reserved. "Dear David, I am in London for the purpose of making certain inquiries. I must not see you, if you can help it. I must be quite alone and unaided. Please pardon my seeming want of confidence. In this matter I am trusting God's help and my own endeavours. But I want you to oblige me by being away from your flat to-night between midnight and 2 a.m. That is all. Perhaps I may be able to explain everything later. Your sincere well-wisher, Violet Mordaunt." Then David ran like a beagle to Euston Station, but Violet had been gone from there nearly an hour, because he found on inquiry that the 9:11 train from Rigsworth had arrived at noon. Yet he could not be content unless he careered about London looking for her, first at Porchester Gardens, then at Dibbin's office, at which he arrived exactly 5 minutes before she did, and he must have driven along Piccadilly while she was turning into the corner from Regent's. London is the biggest bundle of hay when you want to find anybody. Amidst the maelstrom of his doubts and fears, one fact stood out so clearly that he could not fail to recognize it. Not Violet alone, but some other hidden personality, most earnestly desired his absence from the flat that night. In a word, Van Hupfeldt, who knew of the photograph and the letter being hidden there, had the strongest possible reason for seeking an opportunity to make an absolutely unhindered search of every remaining nook and crevice. But how was Violet's anxiety on this head to be explained? Was she too wishful to carry out a scrutiny of pictures, cupboards, and ornaments on her own account? Then, with a sort of intuition, David felt that it was she who had already visited her sister's late abode at such uncanny hours of gloom and mystery that her presence had given rise to the ghost legend. And with the consciousness that this was so came a hot flush of shame and remorse that he had so vilified Violet in his thoughts on the night of his long run from Chalfont. It was she whom he had seen standing at the end of the corridor on the first night of his ever-memorable tenancy of this sorrow-laden abode. And no doubt her earlier efforts at elucidating the dim tragedy which cloaked her sister's death had led to the eerie experiences of Miss L'Estrange and Jenny. Well, thank goodness, he held nearly all the threads of this dark business in his hands now, and it would go hard with Van Hupfeldt if he crossed his path that night. For David resolved, with a smile which had in it a mixture of grimness and tenderness, that he would obey the letter of Violet's request, while decidedly disobeying its spirit. She wished him to be, quote, away from the flat between midnight and 2 a.m. Certainly he would be away, but not far away, near enough, indeed, to know who went into it and who came out, and some part of their business, if he saw fit. Violet, of course, might come and go as she pleased. Not so Van Hupfeldt, or any of his myrmidons. Thereupon, determined to oppose guile to guile, he dismissed the charwoman long before the usual time, and called the friendly hall porter into consultation. "Jim," he said, when the lift shot up to his floor in response to a summons, "I guess you want a drink." Jim knew Harcourt's little ways by this time. "Well, sir," he said, stepping forth and unshipping the motor key, "I'm bound to admit that a slight lubrication wouldn't be amiss. In fact, it might be a hit, a palpable hit. Well, step lively. Here's the whisky. Now, Jim, listen while I talk. I understand there is to be a meeting of ghosts here to-night. No, not a word yet. Drink steadily, Jim. And it is up to you and me to attend the convocation. There is nothing to worry about. These spirits are likely to be less harmful than those you are imbibing. Indeed, we may be called on to grab one or two of them, but they will turn out to be ordinary men. You're not afraid of a man, Jim?" "Not if he's a man, sir. But will there be any shootin'?" "Ah, you heard of that. People will talk of bullet marks, sir, to say nothing of drops of blood." "Drops of blood? Where?" "All round our front door. They wasn't there overnight, and next day there was a revolver bullet stuck in your kitchen skirting board. Excellent, clear proof that our sort of ghosts will bleed if you punch them hard enough on the nose. Now I want your help in 3 ways. In the first place, I am going out about 7 and will return about 9. I want you to make sure that no one enters my flat within those hours. Secondly, when I come back, I wish to reach this floor without coming in by the front door. You understand? If anyone should be watching my movements, I would like to be seen leaving the mansions but not returning. Thirdly, I want you to join me on guard when you close the front door at midnight, hiding the pair of us somewhere above so that we can see, without fear of mistake, any persons who may possess keys which fit my front door. "Oh, that's it, is it?" said the porter, setting down his glass. "Well, I'm your man, sir. Leave everything to me. When you comes home at 9, just pop along the other street until you sees a door leading to a harriet. Drop down there, and you'll find yourself in our basement. At 12 sharp, I'll come up in the lift and fix you up proper." "Jim, you're a treasure," said David. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Late Tenant by Gordon Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Midnight Gathering. When the train from Rigsworth brought Violet into Euston Station, she hurried through the barrier and asked an official to direct her to the nearest post office. At this instant a slight accident happened which had a singular bearing on the events of the day. Neil, the valet, who had driven to Euston just in time to meet the incoming train, had seen her, and was pressing in close pursuit when he tripped over a luggage barrow and fell headlong. He was not much injured, but shaken more than a little, and when he was able to take up the chase again, Violet had vanished. Hence she was freed from espionage, and Van Hupfeldt could only curse his useless emissary. The man Neil certainly did rush about like a whirlwind as soon as he recovered his breath, but Violet was in the post office writing to David, and securely hidden from his ferret eyes. Oddly enough, the first person she wished to see was Miss Ermine Lestrange. She remembered the actress well, as she had visited her once. Jenny, the maid, was out on an errand at the time, and it was one of the many curious discrepancies in the tissue of mingled fact and fiction which obscured her sister's fate, that such a volatile and talkative woman should have written the curt little note sent at Hupfeldt's bidding. Violet could not understand the reason, but she saw a loophole here. The long journey in the train had enabled her to review the information she possessed with a certain clarity and precision hitherto absent from her bewildered thoughts. In a word, there were several marked lines of inquiry, and she was resolved to follow each separately. She felt that she had gone the wrong way to work in the first frenzy of her grief. She was calm now, more skilled in hiding her suspicion, less prone to jump at conclusions. All unknown to her, the little germ of passion planted in her heart by David's few words in the summer-house was governing her whole being. From the timid, irresolute girl who clung to unattainable ideals, she was transformed into a woman ready to dare anything for the sake of the man she loved, while the mere notion of marriage with Van Hupfeldt was so loathsome that she was spurred into the physical need of strenuous action to counteract it. So it was in a restrained yet business-like mood that she climbed the stairs leading to Miss Lestrange's flat and rang the electric doorbell. The door was opened by Jenny. Not all the resources of pert cockneyism availed that hapless domestic when she set eyes on Miss Mordaunt. She uttered a helpless little wail of dismay, and retreated a few steps, as though she half expected the wonder-stricken young woman to use strong measures with her. "Well, what is it now?" came her mistress's sharp demand, for in that small abode there reigned what the Italians call a delightful confidence, Jenny's scream and rush being audible in the drawing-room. "Ow!" stammered Jenny. "It's a young lady, miss." "A young lady? Is she nameless?" "No," said Violet, advancing toward the voice, "but your maid seems to be alarmed by the sight of me. You know me, Miss Lestrange. I only wish I had discovered sooner that you employed my sister's servant, Sarah Gissing." Ermine was accustomed to stage situations. She instantly grasped her part, for she was fresh from the interview with David, and there could be no doubt that the unmasking of Van Hupfeldt was as settled now as the third act of the farcical comedy in which she would play the soubrette that night. "Sarah Gissing," she said with a fine scorn. "That is not her name. She is Jenny. Jenny! I'm blessed if I have ever called her anything else. Here, you, what is your other name?" "Blakey, miss," sobbed Jenny in tears. "But you said only yesterday that you were Sarah Gissing," cried Violet. Yes, miss, and it wasn't true." "So you have never seen my sister?" "No, miss." "Why did you lie to me so shamelessly?" "Please, miss, I was paid for it." "Paid? By Mr. Van Hupfeldt?" "There is some mistake," broke in Miss Lestrange, who was a trifle awed by Violet's quiet dignity. "It was a Mr. Strauss who came here and asked permission for Jenny to have the day free yesterday, in order to give some evidence he required." "Are you quite sure it was Mr. Strauss?" asked Violet, turning away from Jenny, as though the sight of her was offensive. "Positive. I rented, or rather, I took your sister's flat from him, and he has been plaguing my life out ever since about some papers he imagined that I found there." "But you wrote to me a little while ago." "Strauss is a plausible person," countered the other woman readily. "He came here and spun such a yarn that I practically wrote at his dictation." "There is no mistake this time, I hope?" Miss Lestrange's colour rose, and her red hair troubled her somewhat, but she answered with an effort. "There has never been any mistake on my part. Had you come to me in the first instance, and taken me into your confidence, I would have helped you. But you stormed at me quite unjustly, Miss Mordaunt, and it is not in human nature to take that sort of thing lying down, you know." Then, seeing the sorrow in Violet's eyes, she went on with a real sympathy. "I wish we had been more candid with each other at first. And I had nothing whatever to do with Jenny's make-believe of yesterday. The girl is a first-rate cook, but she can tell lies faster than a dog can trot." This poetic simile popped out unawares, but Violet heard the kindly tone rather than the words. "I may want you again," she said simply. "May I rely on you, if the need arises?" "Indeed you may," was the impulsive reply. "I have wept over your sister's unhappy fate, Miss Mordaunt. I always thought Strauss was a villain. I hope that nice young fellow, David Harcourt, who has been on his track for months, will catch him one of these days and give him a hiding at the very least." "Oh, you know Mr. Harcourt?" And then Ermine Lestrange did a thing which ennobled her in her own eyes for many a day. "Yes," she said, "he found out that I occupied your sister's flat after her death, so he came to see me, and, if I may venture to say so, he betrayed an interest in you, Miss Mordaunt, which, had such a man shown it towards me, would have been deemed a very pleasing and charming testimony of his regard." It was only a line out of an old play, but it served, and they kissed each other when they said good-bye. Although Violet was startled at alighting on such ready confirmation of Van Hupfeldt's duplicity, there was a remarkable brightness in her eye, a springtime elasticity in her step, when she emerged into the High Street of Chelsea, which had not been visible a little while earlier. In truth, she felt as a thrush may be supposed to feel after having successfully dodged the attack of a hawk. Were it not that she was treading the crowded streets of London, she would have sung for sheer joy. And now, feeling hungry after her long journey, she entered a restaurant and ate a good meal, which was a sensible thing to do in itself, but which, in its way, was another tiny factor in the undoing of Van Hupfeldt, as, thereby, she missed meeting David at Dibben's office. When she did ultimately reach that unconscious rendezvous, she found there the clerk who had given David such interesting information. This man knew Miss Mordaunt, and had some recollection of the dead Gwendolen. So he was civil, and assured Violet that his master would return from Scotland that evening. "Mr. Dibben has been at Dundee for some days?" asked Violet. "Let me see, miss. He went away on the 4th, and this is the 9th, practically 6 days, counting the journeys." "Then he certainly could not have written to me on the 7th from London?" The clerk was puzzled. "If you mean that he wasn't in London, then—" he began. Violet did not show the man the letter which she had in her pocket. Perhaps it was best that Dibben himself should read it first. But she did say, "He could not have had an interview with a Mr. Van Hupfeldt, for instance?" "Now that is very odd, miss," said the clerk. "That is the very name of the gentleman who wired instructions to-day for Mr. Dibben to go at once to Portsmouth. And, by Jove, begging your pardon, but the telegram came from your place, Rigsworth, in Warwickshire. I never thought of that before." "It doesn't matter," said Violet sweetly. "I shall endeavour to meet Mr. Dibben at King's Cross. And will you please not to mention to anyone that I have called here?" The knowledge that Van Hupfeldt was striving to decoy Dibben away from London revealed that the pursuit had begun. For an instant she was tempted to appeal to David for help, but she had given her word not to see him, and that was sacred, even in relation to one whom she considered to be the worst man breathing. The clerk promised readily enough to observe due discretion anent her visit. He would have promised nearly anything that such a nice-looking girl sought of him. Suddenly Violet recollected that the house agent might know the whereabouts of the real Sarah Gissing. She asked the question, and, Dibben being a man of dockets and pigeonholes, the clerk found the address for her in half a minute, told her where Chalfont was, looked up the next train from Baker Street, and sent her on her way rejoicing. Violet, like the majority of her charming sex, paid small heed to time, and indeed time frequently returns the compliment to pretty women. It was 5 hours ere Dibben was due at King's Cross, and 5 hours were sufficient for almost any undertaking. So she journeyed to Chalfont, found the genuine Sarah, and was alarmed and reassured at the same time by the girl nearly fainting away when she set eyes on her. Here, then, at last, was real news of her Gwen. She could have listened for hours. The landlady of the little hotel charitably let the two talk their fill, and sent them tea in the small parlour where David had met Sarah. Like David, too, whom Sarah did not forget to describe as "that nice young gentleman, Mr. Harcourt," Violet outstayed the train time, and, when she did make an inquiry on this head, it was impossible to reach King's Cross at 6:30 p.m. Amid all the tears and poignancy of grief aroused by the recital of her sister's lonely life and tragic end, there was one strange, unaccountable feature which stood out boldly. Neither by direct word nor veiled inference did Sarah Gissing attribute deliberate neglect or unkindness to Strauss. If anything, her simple story told of a great love between those two, and there was the evidence of it in Gwendolen's latest distracted words about him. Of course, had Violet read the diary, this would have been clear enough. But in view of the man's present attitude, this testimony of the servants was hard to understand. At any rate, Violet, sure now beyond the reach of doubt that Van Hupfeldt was Strauss, and that he was engaged in an incomprehensible conspiracy, nevertheless felt a sensible softening towards him. Perhaps her escape from the threatened marriage had something to do with this. And then the man seemed to have almost worshipped Gwen. Assuredly the gods, meaning to destroy Van Hupfeldt, first decided to make him mad. When he reached Dibben's office, the clerk recognized him as Strauss, and was rendered suspicious by his reappearance, after this long time, within an hour of Violet's calling, seeing that the first person he inquired about was Violet herself. Hence, being of the same mind as Miss Ermine Lestrange as to the secret of success in London life, he failed to recognize any young lady named Mordaunt as among the list of Dibben's visitors that day. Further, when Van Hupfeldt, goaded to extremities, was fain to confess that it was he who had telegraphed from Rigsworth, the clerk became obtuse on the matter of his employer's whereabouts. All he could say definitely was that Dibben would be in his office next morning at 10 o'clock. The outcome of these cross purposes, seeing that David was in no hurry to meet the agent, was that Dibben met only the clerk at King's Cross, and had a mysterious story poured into his ear, together with a bag of gold placed in his hands, as he tackled a chop prior to catching a train for the home of Dibben's at Surbiton. Van Hupfeldt took Mrs. Mordaunt to her old residence at Porchester Gardens, enjoining her not to say a word to Mrs. Harrod about Violet's escapade. That was asking too much of a mother who had endured such heart-searchings during a day of misery. Not even the glamour of a wealthy marriage could blind Mrs. Mordaunt to certain traits in his character which the stress had brought to the surface. She began to ask herself if, after all, Violet were not right in her dread of the man. She was afraid of she knew not what. So kind-hearted was Mrs. Harrod's first natural question as to Violet's well-being, that it drew a flood of tears, and a resultant outpouring of the whole tragedy. But, lo and behold, Mrs. Harrod had dreamed of clear water and a trotting horse the previous night, and this combination was irresistible in its excellence on behalf of her friends. Mrs. Harrod's prophetic dreams were always vicarious. Her own fortunes were fixed. So much per annum earned by keeping a first-rate private hotel. The manifold attractions of town life did not suffice to while away the weary hours of that evening for at least 3 people in London. Violet, returning from Chalfont, took a room in the Great Western Hotel at Paddington, and, when asked to sign the register, obeyed some unaccountable impulse by writing Miss Barnes. It gave her a thrill to see poor Gwendolen's nom de théâtre thus resurrected, and there was something uncanny in the incident too, but she was aroused by the hotel clerk's respectful inquiry if she had any luggage. "No," she said, somewhat embarrassed, "but I will pay for my room in advance, if you wish." "That is not necessary, madam, thank you," was the answer. So Violet, unconscious of the trust reposed in her appearance, took her key and went to rest a little before undertaking the last task she had set herself. She carried in her hand some violets which she had bought from a poor woman outside the hotel. Van Hupfeldt, tortured by want of knowledge of the actions of those in whom he was most interested, was compelled to enlist Neil's services again after reviling him. The valet went openly to Eddystone Mansions and inquired for Harcourt. "He's been out all day," said Jim the porter, speculating on Neil's fighting weight, if he was one of the ghosts to be laid after midnight. Neil brought back this welcome information, and Van Hupfeldt hoped uneasily that his ruse had been successful. If it had, David would be somewhere near Birmingham, and would there await a message from Violet, which Van Hupfeldt would take care he received next day. As for David, he smoked and mused in Hyde Park until after night had fallen. Then he returned to his abode by the way indicated by the porter, and smoked again in the dark and without a fire until a few minutes after midnight, when he heard the clank of the ascending lift, followed by a ring at the door. In case of accident, he had his revolver in his pocket this time. Moreover, his right hand was ready when he opened the door with his left. But it was his ally. Jim pointed to the lift with a grin. "Everybody else is in, sir," he said. "Just step in there and I'll take you to the next floor. We'll switch off the light inside, but leave it on here as usual. Then we can see a mouse coming up the stairs if need be, and there's no other way in unless a real ghost turns up." They took up their position, leaving the door of the lift open. Thus they could step out without noise if necessary. They had not long to wait. Scarcely 5 minutes had elapsed before the porter, with an ear trained to the noises of the building, whispered eagerly, "Someone has just closed the front door, sir." They heard the ascending footsteps. It was Van Hupfeldt, panting, darting quick glances at shadows, hastening up the stairs with a sort of felon fright. In front of number 7 he paused and listened. Apparently not daring to risk everything, he rang the bell. He had not forgotten that a bullet had seared his leg at one of his unauthorized visits. Again he listened, being evidently ready for flight if he heard any answering sound. Then, finding all safe, he produced a key, entered, and closed the door behind him. "Well, I—" began the porter in a tense whisper, this unlawful entry being a sacrilege to him. But David said in his ear, "Let him alone. We have him bottled." Nevertheless, seeing that Violet had undoubtedly stated her intent, or it seemed likely that, to visit the flat that night, he began to consider what he should do if she put in an appearance. What would happen if she unexpectedly encountered Van Hupfeldt within? That must be provided for. The unforeseen difficulty was an instance of the poverty of man's judgment where the future is concerned. In keeping his implied promise to Violet, he would expose her to grave peril. For in David's view, Van Hupfeldt had done her sister to death in that same place, and there was no knowing what crime a man in desperate straits would commit. David was sure now that, actuated by widely different motives, both Van Hupfeldt and Violet were bent on searching for the photograph and letter reposing securely in his own pocket. He smiled grimly as he thought of that which Van Hupfeldt would find, but obviously he ought to warn Violet beforehand. Or would it suffice if he followed quickly after her, thus giving her the opportunity of scaring Van Hupfeldt into the right mood to confess everything? There was a slight risk in that, but it seemed to offer the best solution of a difficulty, and it would avoid the semblance of collusion between them, which Van Hupfeldt was adroit enough to take advantage of. So when Violet did run lightly up the stairs, though his heart beat with joy at the sight of her, he restrained himself until she had opened the door. She applied her key without hesitation. "She trusts me fully, then," thought David, with a pang of regret that he should be compelled now to disobey her. He gripped the porter's arm as he stepped noiselessly out onto the landing above, and thus lost sight of Violet. The man followed, and David, leaning over the stair rail, saw the door of his flat close. He had never before realized how quietly that door might be closed if due care was taken. Even his keen ears heard no sound whatever. And then he heard that which sent the blood in a furious race from his brain to his heart and back to his brain again, for there came from within a cry as from some beast in pain, and, quickly following, the shriek of a woman in mortal fear. David waited for no key-turning. He dashed in the lock with his foot and entered. The first thing that greeted his disordered senses was the odour of violets, which came to him fresh and pungent, with an eerie reminiscence of the night he thought he saw the spectral embodiment of dead Gwendolen. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Late Tenant by Gordon Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Van Hupfeldt makes amends. Violet's first act, on entering the hall, had been to turn on the light. She did this without giving a thought to the possibility of disturbing some prior occupant. The day's events demonstrated how completely David was worthy of faith. She was assured that he would obey the behest in her letter. How much better would it have been had she trusted intuition in the first instance? But it chanced that David had written a little note to her on an open sheet of paper, which he pinned to the tablecloth in the dining-room, in such a position that she could not fail to see it when there was a light, and this note, headed "To Violet," contained the fateful message: "I have found the photograph of Strauss, or Van Hupfeldt, and with it the letter in which he announced to your sister that he was already married to another woman." Van Hupfeldt, of course, had seen this thrice convincing and accusing document, which proved not only that he and his secret were in David's power, but that David had expected Violet to visit his dwelling. He was sitting at a table in the stupor of rage and terror when he fancied he heard a rustling in the outer passage. Beside himself with anger at the threatened downfall of his cardboard castle, strung to a state of high nervous tension by the horror he had of that abode of dreadful memories, he half turned toward the door, which had swung back almost into its place. Through the chink he noticed an exterior radiance. Nevertheless, he paid no heed to it, although his wearied brain seemed to remind him that he had not left a light in the corridor. Yet again he heard another rustle, as of a woman's garments. This time he sprang up with the madness of hysteria in his eyes. He tore open the door and saw Violet near to him. She, noting the movement of the door, stood stock still with surprise and some fear, ungovernable emotions which undoubtedly gave a touch of wan tragedy to her expression. Moreover, the glow of the hall lamp was now behind her, and her features were somewhat in gloom. So it was not to be wondered at that Van Hupfeldt, with his conscience on the rack, thought he was actually looking at the embodied spirit of Gwendolen. He expected to see the dead woman, and he was far too unhinged to perceive that he was face to face with a living one. He threw up his arms, uttered that horrible screech which had reached the ears of David and the porter, and collapsed limply to the floor, whence, from his knees, while he sank slowly, he gazed at the frightened girl with such an awful look of a doomed man that she in turn screamed aloud. Then she saw a thin stream of blood issuing from between his pallid lips, and, the strain being too great, she fainted, so that David, after bursting in the door and finding the two bodies prostrate, one on each side of the entrance to the dining-room, imagined for one agonizing second that another and more ghastly crime had been enacted in those haunted chambers. He lifted Violet tenderly in his arms, and guessed at once that she had been overcome by the sight of Van Hupfeldt, who, at first glance, seemed to have inflicted some mortal injury on himself. The hall porter, aghast at the discovery of two people apparently dead whom he had seen alive a few minutes earlier, kept his wits sufficiently together to stoop over Van Hupfeldt. Then he, too, noticed the blood welling forth. "It's all right, sir," cried he in a queer, cracked voice to David. "This here gent's only broke a blood vessel." David said something which had better be forgotten, and just then Violet, who was not at all of the lymphatic order, opened her eyes and looked at him. "Thank God," he whispered close to her lips, and she, scarce comprehending her whereabouts yet, made a brave effort to smile at him. He carried her into the little drawing-room, and he now placed her in a chair. "Have no fear," he said. "I am here. I shall not leave you." He ran to the door. "If that man's condition is serious, you had better summon a doctor," he cried to the porter, whom he saw engaged in the effort to prop Van Hupfeldt's body against a chair. David was pitiless. Perhaps he had not yet recovered from the shock of finding Violet lying prostrate. "He mustn't be allowed to fall down, sir," said Jim anxiously, "or he will choke. I've seen a case like this before." David, though quickly subsiding from his ferment, was divided between the claims of Violet and the demands of humanity. Personally, he thought that the Dutchman would be no loss to the world. But the man was helpless, and now Violet, recovering strength and recollection with each more regular breath, knew what had happened. She stood up tremblingly. "Let us go to him," she said with the fine chivalry of woman, and soon, kneeling on each side of Van Hupfeldt, they supported him and endeavoured to stanch the outpouring from his lips. The porter hurried away. David, wondering what to do for the best, held his enemy's powerless body a little inclined forward, and asked Violet if she would bring a wet towel from the bathroom, and wrapped it round Van Hupfeldt's forehead. The relief thus afforded was effective, and the flow of blood had ceased when the porter returned with a doctor who lived in the next block of dwellings. The doctor made light of the hemorrhage, but he detected a pulse which made him look up at the others gravely. "This is a bad case of heart failure," he said. "The rupture of a blood vessel is merely a symptom. Has he had a sudden shock?" "I fear so," said David. "What can we do for him?" "Nothing at present," was the ominous answer. "I dread even the necessity of moving him to a bedroom. Certainly he cannot be taken elsewhere. Is he a friend of yours? I understand he does not live here." David was saved from the difficulty of answering by a feeble indication of Van Hupfeldt's wish to speak. The doctor gave him some water, then a little weak brandy and water. Violet again helped David to hold him, and the unfortunate man, seemingly recognizing her, now turned his head toward her. "Forgive me," he whispered, with the labored distinctness of one who speaks with the utmost effort. "I've deceived you vilely. I wished to make reparation." "I think I know all you wish to tell me," said Violet bravely. "And even so, I am sorry for you." "You heard what the doctor said," he muttered. "Yes, but you will recover. Don't try to talk. You must calm yourself. Then the doctor will help." "I know more than he knows of my own condition. I am dying. I shall be dead in a few minutes. It is only just. I shall die here, where Gwen died. My Gwen, whom I loved more than my own soul. May God forgive." "Oh, don't!" cried Violet brokenly. The presence of grey death, that last and greatest adjuster of wrong, obliterated many a bitter vow and stifled the cry for vengeance in her. "It is just," he whispered again. "I killed her by that letter, and now she has summoned me to the grave, she who gave her life to shield me. Ah, what a punishment was mine! When I flew here from Paris to tell her that all was well, and arrived only in time to see her die. She died in my arms, just as I am dying in yours, Vi. But she suffered, and I, who deserve all the suffering, am falling away without pain." Truly, he seemed to gain strength as he spoke. He still fancied he had seen Gwendolen. The gathering mists clouded his brain to that extent. Violet's eyes were dim with tears. Her lips trembled so that she could scarce utter a word. The doctor, who was watching Van Hupfeldt narrowly, said to her in a low tone, "Take my advice and leave us now." But Van Hupfeldt had heard him, and roused himself determinedly for a final effort. Yet he spoke with difficulty and brokenly. "I escaped down the service lift that night. Once again, when Harcourt shot at me, I only wished to atone, Vi. I made my will, you know. The lawyers will explain. The boy, Mrs. Carter, New Street, Birmingham. See to the boy, Vi. For Gwen's sake. Ah, God, for her sake." And that was all. Violet, weeping bitterly, was led away. From over the mantelpiece the wild eyes of a portrait in chalk of a beautiful woman looked down in pity, it may be, on the dead face of the man lying on the floor. And so ended the sad love story of Henry Van Hupfeldt and Gwendolen Mordaunt. In the street beneath, hansoms were jingling along, bringing people home from the restaurants. London recked little of the last scene of one of its many dramas. Yet it had its sequel in life and love, for Violet and her mother, as the result of a telegram to Birmingham, took into their arms a happy and crowing infant, a fine baby boy, who won his way to their hearts by his instant readiness to be fondled by them, and who retained his place in their affections by the likeness he bore to his dead mother. Though his hair was dark, and he promised to have the Spanish profile of his father, his eyes were Gwen's blue ones, and his lips parted in the merry smile they knew so well. But that was next day, when the fount of tears was nearly dry, and the shudderings of the night had passed. Lucky it was for Violet that David was near. What would have become of her had she regained her senses and found herself alone in the flat, alone with a dead man? David, somewhat hardened by his career in the turbulent West, quickly hit upon a line of action. The doctor, a good soul, volunteered to drive to Van Hupfeldt's residence and summon Neil, who would probably bear the Porter company during a night vigil in the flat. David therefore made Violet drink a little brandy, and, talking steadily the while, compelling occasional answers to his questions, he led her to a cab, which he directed to Porchester Gardens. He knew that in Mrs. Harrod she would find a friend, and it was an added relief to him to discover, after repeated ringing had brought a servant to the door, that Mrs. Mordaunt was there too. To save Violet the undue strain of an explanation, he asked that her mother might be aroused. There was no need for that. She was downstairs promptly, having heard the imperative bell, certain that news of Violet was to hand. So he told of the night's doings to a tearful and perplexed woman who had never previously set eyes on him, and it was 3 o'clock ere he turned his face towards Eddystone Mansions again. Arrived there, he found that the porter and Neil had carried the unfortunate Van Hupfeldt to the room in which Gwendolen died. That was chance. It must have been something more than chance which caused David to pick up the bunch of violets torn from the breast of their wearer when she fell in a faint, and place them on the pillow near the pallid head. David was sorry for the man, after all. In one matter the sorely tried mother and daughter were fortunate. There was no inquest. The doctor who was present at Van Hupfeldt's death, after consulting the coroner and a West End specialist who had warned the sufferer of his dangerous state, was able to give a burial certificate in due form. Thus all scandal and sensation-mongering were avoided. The interment took place in Kensal Green Cemetery. Van Hupfeldt's mortal remains were laid to rest near those of the woman he loved. Violet was his sole heiress, under the will he had executed. A sealed letter, attached by him to that document, explained his motive. In case of accident prior to the contemplated marriage, he thereby surmounted the legal difficulty and inevitable exposure of providing for the child. He asked Violet to take the requisite steps to administer the estate, bidding her reserve a capital sum sufficient to provide the £10,000 per annum given her by the marriage settlement, and set apart the residue, under trustees, for the benefit of the boy. At first she refused to touch a penny of the money, but wiser counsels prevailed. There would not only be a serious tangle in the business if she declined the bequest, but Van Hupfeldt was so rich that nearly 5 times the amount was left for the child, the value of the estate being considerably over £1,000,000 sterling. The requisite investigation of the sources of his wealth cleared up a good deal that was previously obscure. Undoubtedly he had been helped in his early career, that of a musician, by a Mrs. Strauss, widow of a California merchant. She educated him, and, yielding to a foolish passion, offered to make him her heir if he married her and assumed the name of Strauss, she having already attained some notoriety in Continental circles under that designation. She was a malade imaginaire, in the sense that she would seldom reside more than a few weeks in any one place, while she positively detested both England and America. He was kind to her, and she was devoted to him, but unlimited wealth cloyed when it involved constant obedience to her whims. Yet rather than lose him altogether, she agreed to his occasional visits to England during the season, and when hunting was toward. Eager to shake off the thraldom of the Strauss regime, he then invariably passed under his real name of Van Hupfeldt. Hence, when he fell in love with Gwendolen, and resolved to make her his in defiance of all social law, he was obliged to tell her that he was also Johann Strauss, and under an obligation to Mrs. Strauss, who had adopted him. Gwendolen's diary, which, with the certificates, was found in a bureau, became clear enough when annotated with these facts. Van Hupfeldt himself left the fewest possible papers, the letter accompanying the will merely setting forth his wishes, and announcing that he desired to marry Violet as an act of reparation to the memory of her sister. This had become a mania with him. The unhappy man thought that this way he could win forgiveness. And then the bright world became a valley of despair for David Harcourt. During many a bitter hour he lamented Van Hupfeldt's death. Alive, he was a rival to be fought and conquered. Dead, he had interposed that insurmountable barrier of great wealth between Violet and one who was sick for love of her. Poor David! He sought refuge in work, and found his way up some rungs of the literary ladder, but he could neither forget his Violet nor follow her to Dale Manor, the inaccessible, fenced in now by a wall of gold. Once he was in a hansom on the way to Euston, telling himself he was going to Rigsworth to give the gamekeeper that promised licking, but he stopped the cab and returned, saying bitterly, "Why am I trying to fool myself? That is not the David of my acquaintance." So he went back, calling in at a florist's and buying a huge bowlful of violets, thinking to reach Nirvana by their scent, and thereby humbugging himself so egregiously that he was in despondent mood when he sat down to a lonely tea in his flat. He had not seen or heard of Violet in 3 long months, not since he took Mrs. Mordaunt and her to the train for Warwickshire, and, walking afterward with Dibbin from the station, learned the fateful news of her intolerable inheritance. He had promised to write, but he had not written. What was he to say? That he still loved her, although she was rich? Perhaps he dreamed that she would write to him, but no. Silence was the steady scheme of things, and work 14 hours a day was the solution, until his bronzed face began to take on the student's cast, and he wondered at times if he had ever caught and saddled a bronco, or slept under the stars, or was it all a dream? Wanting some bread, and being alone, the charwoman having believed his statement that he would be away until next midday, he went into the kitchen. It was now high summer, hot with the stable-like heat of London, and the kitchen window was wide open. Some impulse prompted him to look out and examine the service lift, by way of which Van Hupfeldt had twice quitted the flat. Once, when driven by mad fear of being held guilty of Gwendolen's death, and again to save his life from David's revolver. Given a steady brain and some little athletic skill, the feat was easy enough. All that was needed was to cling to two greasy iron uprights and slide from one floor to the next, where crossbars marked the different stories and provided halting places for the lift. It was typical of Van Hupfeldt that he had the nerve to essay this means of escape, and the cunning to think of it. David was looking into the well of the building, 100 feet below, when an electric bell jarred over his head. Someone was at the front door. It was a porter. "You are wanted downstairs, sir," said he, his honest face all of a grin. "Downstairs?" repeated David, puzzled. "Yes, sir. There's a hansom waiting, sir." "Oh," said David, wondering what he had left in his cab. He went down, hatless, and not a word said Jim, though he watched David out of the corner of his eye and smiled broadly when he saw David's sudden recognition of Violet through the side window of the hansom. She, too, smiled delightedly when David appeared. "I want you to come with me for a little drive," she said, "but not without a hat. That would be odd." David, casting off 3 months' cobwebs in a second, was equal to the emergency. Somehow the damask of Violet's flushed cheeks banished the dull tints in his. "Jim," he said, "here's my key. Bring me a hat. Any old hat. First hat you can grab." Then he climbed into the vacant seat by her side. "Do you know," he said, "I was nearly going to Ringsworth today." "I only know," she replied, "that you were to write to me, and I have had no letter." "Don't put me on my self-defence, or I shan't care twopence if you are worth 10,000 or 10 millions a year," he said. Violet leaned over the door. "That man is a long time going for your hat," she said. "By the way, can you spare the time to drive with me to Kensal Green? And then I am able to take you to Porchester Gardens, where Mother expects you to dine with us, en famille, so you need not return here." She was a little breathless, and spoke in a fluster. Jim arrived with the missing headgear. The driver whipped up his horse, and David's left arm went round Violet's waist. She bent forward, astonished, with a sidelong glance of questioning. "It is a reasonable precaution," said David. "If the horse goes down, you don't fall out." Violet laughed and blushed prettily. A bus driver, eyeing them, jerked his head at the cabman. "All right, the lady," he said, and the cabman winked. But the two inside knew nothing of this ribaldry. So, you see, David simply couldn't help himself. Or rather, from another point of view, he did help himself to a remarkably charming wife and a considerable fortune. Miss Ermine Lestrange insisted on an invitation to the wedding, which took place at Rigsworth, as quietly as the inhabitants of that village would allow. The volatile actress won such favour from a local land agent in a fair way of business that he goes to town far too frequently, people say, and it is highly probable that her name will be changed soon to a less euphonious one, which will be good for her and excellent for the land agent's business. Sarah Gissing found a new post as Master Henry's nurse, and Mrs. Carter was well rewarded for the care she had taken of the boy. The postmistress's sister received a fine diamond ring when David, by dint of judicious questioning, found out the identity of the friend who sent that most timely telegram. and, strangely enough, the surly gamekeeper never received either the £50 or the thrashing or the sack, but was minus the silver paid to his poacher assistants for their night watch. So even this little side issue, out of the many grave ones raised by David's tenancy of an ordinary flat in an ordinary London mansion, shows how often the unexpected happens, even in ordinary life. End of chapter 22. End of The Late Tenant by Gordon Holmes. Recording by Kirsten Wever.